In the Highlands, old debts were never truly forgiven, only bought, sold, and quietly buried under new names. Robbie Ainsley had made peace with that a long time ago. What he hadn't made peace with was the particular Alpha King who would, without asking permission, dig every one of those old debts back up and hand them to him healed. The ferry crossing from the mainland to Kilbride had been rough enough to leave Robbie Ainsley soaked to the bone, green around the gills, and thoroughly done with the entire concept of Scotland by the time the castle's iron-studded door finally loomed out of the mist above him. Robbie Ainsley, 27, former marine insurance claims adjuster in Glasgow, until his late father's debts to the Blackwater lending ring swallowed his savings whole. Omega, dry-humored, unflappable, deeply suspicious of anyone who smiles too easily. He had exactly one instruction from the solicitor's letter. Present yourself at the West Gate at 4 o'clock. He arrived at 3:48, found the West Gate unattended, and, reasoning that a castle this enormous surely had more than one entrance a person could use, let himself in through a low, half-open door that turned out to lead directly into the wine cellar. He got exactly 4 steps in, admiring a truly staggering wall of whiskey casks by torchlight, before 2 enormous men in kilts and tactical vests seized him by both arms. Caught him red-handed, Alpha Malcolm. One of them announced triumphantly to absolutely no one, since Alpha Malcolm was not present. Poacher. Smells of the ferry and looks like he's casing the good stock. I'm not casing anything, Robbie said, with the flat calm of a man who had once talked down an armed loan shark over an unpaid invoice, and found the experience only marginally worse than this. I'm here for a 4 o'clock appointment. I took a wrong door. That's precisely what a whiskey thief would say. It's precisely what a person who took a wrong door would also say. Those two things sound the same because they are the same sentence, structurally. They locked him in the cellar's small holding alcove anyway, apparently a standing policy for anyone caught among the good stock, and left him sitting on an overturned crate, dripping steadily onto 400 years of stone flooring, listening to muffled shouting from somewhere above. The shouting, it turned out, belonged to a slim, theatrical Omega in a green tartan coat, currently mid-tantrum in the great hall directly overhead, judging by how clearly the sound carried down the old stone stairwell. You cannot simply cancel the engagement announcement in the Highland Gazette, James. I already sent my aunt a save-the-date. Oliver, we went to one Highland Games together. You spent the whole afternoon describing your cousin's yacht in the Solent. That yacht was entirely relevant context for the kind of life you'd be offering me. Robbie, still soaked, still locked in a cellar, found he could not entirely suppress a small disbelieving laugh. It carried, unfortunately, straight up the stairwell. There was a pause, then heavy, deliberate footsteps started down the stone steps. The door to the holding alcove swung open, and Robbie found himself looking up at the largest man he had ever seen in his life. Dark hair, a jaw carved from granite, and eyes the pale, unnerving gray of loch water under a winter sky. James Kilbride, 33. Laird of Clan Kilbride, known across the Highlands, not always fondly, as the Alpha King. Cold, exacting, has not been seen to laugh in public in the better part of a decade. Who, James said, in the tone of a man already bracing for disappointment, locked a dripping stranger in my whiskey cellar? Your security did. I took the wrong door. In my defense, your castle has an alarming number of doors, and none of them are labeled. Robbie gestured, with some dignity, at his own soaked and shivering state. I'm also freezing, which I mention not for sympathy, but because hypothermia seems like a poor start to whatever meeting I was supposed to be having. James studied him for a long moment, the ruined boots, the single duffel bag abandoned somewhere upstairs, the utter absence of fear in a man who had just been manhandled by 2 of his guards. Something flickered behind that pale gray stare, distant and unfamiliar. You're the Omega from the marriage brief, James said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm the Omega who took a wrong door and got arrested for it, but sure, let's also go with that. From the top of the stairs, Oliver's voice rang down, aghast. Is that him, James? He was found in your cellar, dripping like a drowned collie. And you're telling me this is meant to replace me? I'm not replacing anyone, Robbie called back up, entirely unbothered. I'm just extremely wet and would like to be let out of a cellar, if that's not too much trouble for anyone involved in this apparently ongoing drama. For one unguarded second, James Kilbride's mouth did something it plainly hadn't done in a very long while. Smile, but close enough to startle him. Let him out, James said over his shoulder, to the guards still hovering, mortified, at the top of the stairs. Then to Robbie, holding out a hand to help him up off the crate. "You'll want dry clothes before Abernathy gets his contract in front of you, and an apology, apparently, from my entire household. I'll accept the dry clothes. Keep the apology. I've had worse welcomes." Robbie took the offered hand, wincing at how thoroughly his own fingers had gone numb, and did not miss the way James's grip lingered, just slightly, before releasing him. Behind them, Oliver made a sound like a bagpipe running out of air, and swept out through the great hall doors in a flurry of green tartan, nearly upending a footman carrying an armful of heather. James watched him go with the mild patience of a man observing weather he had long since stopped being surprised by. Then he looked back at Robbie, damp and shivering and entirely unimpressed by the last 20 minutes of his life, and something in his chest did a small, unfamiliar thing he did not yet have a name for. "This way," James said, and turned, expecting, the way lairds generally expect most things, to be followed. Mr. Abernathy, the family's solicitor, had the particular weathered patience of a man who had drafted this exact style of contract 3 times before for 3 different Kilbride lairds, and clearly expected this negotiation to go no differently than the others. He was wrong within the first 90 seconds. "You will attend no fewer than 4 clan functions per season," Abernathy read, tablet propped on his knee, the cellar's chill still clinging faintly to Robbie's borrowed shirt. "You will present as a devoted and dignified mate at all public gatherings. Clause 9 addresses bodily autonomy within the private residence." "I read that one twice on the ferry crossing," Robbie said. "It's the only clause written like your predecessor was personally sued for something unfortunate." Abernathy's spectacles slid an inch down his nose. James, seated across the room with a dram of whiskey he had not yet touched, watched Robbie with the stillness of a man observing a species he'd been told didn't exist. "He was," James said, mildly. "Twice, actually. Clause 9 exists because my grandfather had opinions about consent that the courts eventually did not share. Comforting family history. I don't offer comfort, Mr. Ainsley. I offer £4 million, 5 years, and my name, which still opens doors your father's debts closed." A pause, level and unhurried. "The Blackwater ring won't touch you again once this is signed. I've made certain of it personally." Robbie's pen stilled over the tablet. He hadn't mentioned Blackwater by name in any paperwork he'd submitted. "You looked into my father's debt. I look into everything that walks into my castle uninvited and gets arrested in my cellar within the hour," James said, and there was, beneath the dryness, something almost gentle. "4 million, 5 years. Your own wing, your own income, your own schedule outside of the clan calendar. In exchange, my council stops asking why their laird has no mate, and the Sterling faction stops circling my chair like gulls." Robbie looked at the fire instead of the tablet, thought, briefly, ruthlessly, of the 2 men in decent coats who'd come to his flat above the chip shop with a number and a deadline, and no particular interest in whether he survived paying it. "What happens if I embarrass you?" Robbie asked, not looking up from the tablet. "Say something unforgivable to a reporter. Fall face first into the Firth at a state function. Then you apologize prettily, the press forgets it within a fortnight, and we carry on. I'm not marrying you for perfection, Mr. Ainsley. I'm marrying you for plausibility." "Charming. Put it on a plaque. I'll hang it in the tower." Abernathy cleared his throat, clearly unaccustomed to negotiations veering so far from script. "There is also the matter of the heat clause, Section 11. Should Mr. Ainsley experience a heat during the contract's term, Laird Kilbride is obligated to provide appropriate privacy and accommodation, but is under no circumstance to." "I read that section twice on the ferry," Robbie said. "It reads like whoever drafted it had personally been sued by a very angry deity." James's gaze sharpened, something unreadable moving behind it. "You'll be given whatever you need. A separate wing of the tower, if you prefer. Suppressants approved by the estate physician for your particular strain, should you want them. Generous, for a business transaction. I don't do things by half measures. Mr. Ainsley, not contracts, not marriages, not even ones I didn't especially want to begin with." A pause, brief and unreadable. "Sign it or don't, but decide before the fire needs building up again, because I've a council meeting at 7 and precious little patience left for either of you." 5 years, Robbie said. "I can survive anything for 5 years if the number holds." He signed, clean, no hesitation. Abernathy tapped his screen, a soft chime. Funds are already transferred, Mr. Ainsley. Your belongings have been collected from Glasgow. I only had the one bag. Yes, Abernathy said, with the mild pity of a man delivering news gently. We rather assumed. James stood, rolling his shoulders, as though shedding the last of the meeting's formality. Mrs. Doyle will show you to the East Tower. Dinner's at 8. Don't let the cellar incident set a precedent for lateness. I was early. I simply chose the door reserved for people who don't especially want to be here. Something crossed James's face again, quick, reluctant, gone before Robbie could properly name it, and he left without further comment, leaving Robbie alone with Abernathy and the fire and the distinct, sinking suspicion that the practical, unremarkable arrangement he'd just signed his name to was not going to stay practical for very long at all. The Great Hall's dining table was old enough to have hosted clan feuds, ceasefires, and if the tapestries were to be believed, at least one recorded poisoning. Robbie found it by following the scent trailing down from the stairwell, peat smoke and heather, dense and territorial, pressing against his ribs with an ancient biological insistence that he lower his eyes and bare his throat to the room's alpha. He shoved his hands into his borrowed jumper's pockets instead, and kept his spine stubbornly straight. James was already seated at the head of the table, a glass of amber liquid untouched at his elbow, watching the door with the same unreadable stillness he'd worn in the cellar. Robbie chose a seat a full 12 feet down the table and sat without waiting to be invited. You're very far away, James observed. I have a terrible habit of narrating my own thoughts out loud while I eat. Thought I'd spare you. A muscle shifted at the corner of James's jaw. Not a smile, but its close relation. Move closer, he said, and beneath the words ran a low current of command, ancient and compelling, the kind that made lesser Omega's knees buckle before they'd even decided to obey. Robbie didn't move an inch. Clause 9, he said instead, calm as still water. Bodily autonomy within the private residence. I like this seat. It's got a clear line to the door, should the whiskey thief accusations resume. Silence pooled thick over the table. James set his glass down with a small, deliberate click and looked at Robbie properly for the first time since the cellar, not as a line item on a contract, but as a person. The tired set of his mouth, the stubborn, unshaking calm of someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, not to flinch. You're not what the brief described, James said slowly. The brief described a practical Omega who wouldn't cause trouble. I'd say I'm well within variance. I simply define trouble more narrowly than your solicitor does. Dinner arrived. Venison, roasted root vegetables, bread still warm from Mrs. Doyle's kitchen. Robbie ate methodically, the unhurried way of a man who'd once gone 4 days on tinned soup and had never quite unlearned the lesson in it. James didn't touch his own plate. He watched instead, elbows braced on the table, until Robbie finally set his fork down. You're staring. Most Omegas in your position, James said, would already be angling for my bed, or my accounts. I spent 6 years adjusting marine insurance claims. I've seen what a fortune costs the people who chase it. I want none of your bed and less of your boardroom. I want to survive 5 years, collect what's owed, and buy a small cottage on Skye where the postman doesn't know my surname. Robbie picked his fork back up. This venison, for what it's worth, is genuinely excellent. Tell your kitchen staff, since it certainly isn't your doing. Something in James's scent shifted, the sharp peat edge of irritation softening into something warmer, more curious. He had spent his adult life surrounded by people who wanted a piece of his name, his title, his chair, and here sat a soaked, broke, entirely unimpressed stranger, calmly critiquing his hospitality like a mildly disappointed innkeeper. James laughed. It was short, rusty, startled clean out of him, the sound of a man rediscovering a language he'd stopped speaking years ago. Robbie looked up, caught off guard in turn. For one unguarded second, their eyes held. James's gray gone soft at the edges, Robbie's own flat composure cracking, just slightly, at the sound of a laird laughing like he'd genuinely forgotten how. 5 years is a long stretch to spend unimpressed with a man, James said. I've survived worse for less, Robbie said, but the edge had gone out of his voice, and neither of them remarked on it. He rose, left half his meal, and walked out without asking leave, a small, deliberate rebellion. James watched the empty doorway long after Robbie had gone, turning his glass slowly by the stem, and understood, with the particular unease of a man realizing he had badly misjudged the terms of his own arrangement, that he did not want Robbie Ainsley to stay unimpressive at all. Rain ticked steadily against the old windows, and somewhere above the hall, a broke stranger who did not yet know he'd already shifted something. In that house was falling asleep in a bed, softer than any misery he'd grown accustomed to. Clan tradition demanded a formal portrait be commissioned before any handfasting. One more item on the color-coded schedule Mrs. Doyle delivered to Robbie's door each morning like a sentence. The painter, a bright, easily delighted young man named Fergus, arrived with an easel, 3 brushes, and considerably more enthusiasm for Robbie's cheekbones than the job strictly called for. "You've got a marvelous jaw for portraiture," Fergus said, for the second time, tilting Robbie's chin with 2 careful fingers toward the window light. "Most sitters go stiff as a board. You hold stillness like you've done this before." "I've held stillness through worse things than a painting," Robbie said, entirely unbothered, gaze fixed somewhere past Fergus's shoulder. He didn't notice the study door open behind him. He did notice the sudden, total silence of the room. The way Fergus's fingers dropped from his chin as though scalded, the way the light itself seemed to cool by several degrees. James stood in the doorway, a stack of correspondence forgotten in one hand, his scent gone sharp and cold as lock water in January. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Fergus retreated 3 full steps without seeming to notice he'd moved at all. "The light's wrong from that angle," James said, crossing the room, voice carrying an edge Robbie hadn't heard at dinner. "Move the easel. Alpha, the composition's all ready. Move it." Fergus moved it with admirable speed, abandoning his brush mid-stroke. Robbie watched the whole performance with open, delighted interest, arms still folded from where Fergus had posed them a minute before. "He was adjusting my chin, James. Not proposing marriage. He touched your face for a full minute. 40 seconds, generously." "I counted a minute," James said, and there was something almost sulky beneath the growl of it. An alpha king reduced, briefly and thoroughly, to petty arithmetic. Robbie turned fully on the little dais to face him, fighting and losing a battle against his own smile. "Are you jealous of the portrait painter, James?" "I don't get jealous." The denial came too fast, too flat, the unmistakable tell of a man lying badly for perhaps the first time in a decade. "You just relocated an entire easel using nothing but your face." James's jaw ticked. He said nothing further, which Robbie decided was its own small confession, and instead inspected the half-finished canvas with the fierce concentration of a man who had absolutely, categorically, not just been jealous of a portrait painter. "Dark green for the tartan sash," James said, finally, to the room at large, without meeting Robbie's eyes. "It suits him better than the blue." He left without another word, but not before Robbie caught, at the very edge of the closing door, the faint, helpless curve of his mouth, the second one in 2 days, both entirely of Robbie's making. Alone with Fergus again, Robbie found he was smiling too, and had absolutely no idea what to do with the warm, unfamiliar satisfaction of having made a laird jealous over nothing at all. The games themselves happened the morning before the ball, on the wide green haugh below the castle, and Robbie had assumed, wrongly it turned out, that his own involvement would be limited to standing at the rope line, looking politely interested, while enormous men in kilts threw logs at the sky. He had not accounted for Great Aunt Morag entering him in the spectators' wager pool, a clan tradition wherein guests bet, loudly and with real money, on which competitor would embarrass himself worst. Nor had he accounted for James, mid-turn in the Heavy Stones event, catching sight of a young farmhand attempting to teach Robbie the correct grip for the hammer throw, with both hands wrapped rather too thoroughly around Robbie's own. The caber James was mid-lift promptly wavered, then toppled sideways with a groan of timber, narrowly missing a startled piper. "That's 4 points to Kilbride for style," the games marshal called out, unbothered, "and 0 for distance on account of nearly killing Angus." "He grabbed my hands," Robbie said later, delighted, as James stalked back toward the rope line, still dusting bark off his sleeves. "You dropped an entire tree because a farmhand held my hands for the hammer grip." "I did not drop it because of that." "You absolutely did. I watched it happen." Half the glen watched it happen. Morag's already collected 40 pounds off Malcolm, who bet against you specifically because you never lose composure in public. James's ears had gone faintly, unmistakably red, a color Robbie had not previously believed the man's complexion capable of producing. The wind shifted. "There is no wind. It's the stillest morning we've had all week. The grass was uneven. James, I don't get jealous of farmhands, James said with the wounded dignity of a man who had, in fact, just very publicly gotten jealous of a farmhand in front of his entire clan at considerable cost to a perfectly good caber. Robbie decided, watching him retrieve his composure with visible effort, that this was possibly the single most satisfying 40 pounds Great Aunt Morag had ever won off anybody, and made a private note to thank her for the wager later. The Highland Games ball, held that same evening in the Great Hall of Edinburgh Castle, drew half the country's aristocracy, and every camera crew fool enough to brave the crush for a photograph of the reclusive Alpha King. Remember the story, James said in the car, adjusting his cufflinks with the bored precision of a man who'd rehearsed this 100 times. We met through the Highland Heritage Trust, a whirlwind courtship. We value our privacy. Keep your answers brief. I read the packet. I know the lines. Knowing lines and selling them convincingly are different disciplines entirely. Watch me. The door opened onto a wall of flashbulbs and tartan and noise. James stepped out first, commanding the space the way he commanded every room he entered, then turned and offered a hand back into the car. Robbie took a breath, folded his cynicism into a small mental drawer, and stepped out, curling his fingers naturally around James's palm. He didn't just take the hand. He tipped his face up, found James's eyes, and smiled, soft, unguarded, the exact smile an Omega gives the one person in a crowded room who actually matters. James, mid-stride, faltered, small, a half-step of genuine surprise, quickly smoothed, but Robbie felt it through their joined hands and tucked the small victory away with private satisfaction. They'd made it barely halfway across the hall before the ambush arrived. Well, well. The voice belonged to a tall, sharp-featured alpha with slicked ginger hair and a glass of single malt he clearly hadn't earned the palate for. The famous new acquisition, Malcolm Sterling. I sit on the clan council, a cousin several times removed, and considerably more patient with James than most. Malcolm Sterling, 35, head of the clan's distillery board, resents that the Kilbride title skipped his own branch of the family by 2 generations. Robbie said, pleasantly, not offering his hand. I'll admit, when James said he'd found a mate, we expected, rather more. Someone with a pedigree, someone who doesn't smell of fairy diesel and second-hand wool. Tell me, how much did it cost to fish you out from under your father's debts? Must be nice, finding a laird to bail you out of the gutter. Robbie took a slow sip of his sparkling water, entirely unmoved. Malcolm, was it? You chair the distillery board, the same board that lost the Speyside export contract last quarter. 12% drop in overseas revenue, roughly £2.1 million, if the filing I read was accurate. Malcolm's smug expression faltered. I read council minutes for entertainment, Robbie continued, mild as milk. If I were you, I'd worry rather less about my pedigree, and considerably more about my own seat at that board. James doesn't strike me as a man who tolerates underperformance for long, particularly from family who overcompensate with cologne strong enough to strip a cask. Malcolm's scent spiked, sharp and furious, an aggressive pulse of dominance aimed squarely at Robbie's spine. Robbie felt the old biological pull of it, the ancient urge to lower his eyes, bare his throat, and simply blinked through it, unmoved, the way one blinks through a draft. Is there a problem? James's voice dropped the temperature of the hall by several degrees. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. His scent, peat smoke and heather, rolled over Malcolm's cologne and extinguished it entirely, a silent, brutal claim. No, Alpha. Just getting acquainted. You're finished getting acquainted. Walk away, Malcolm. Malcolm did not need telling twice. James turned to Robbie, scanning his face for distress and finding, instead, the same maddening calm he'd worn through the whole exchange. Did he touch you? No, and I had it handled. You're my mate. You don't have to handle council members. I'm your business partner, Robbie corrected, quiet enough for James alone. And I don't need you fighting my battles for me. I need you to keep paying my invoice on schedule. Something flickered across James's face. Not quite hurt, not quite amusement. Something caught between the two, before he offered his arm with exaggerated formality. Come. The Lord Provost's wife has been asking after our wedding tartan for 20 minutes. I'd like to disappoint her properly in person. Robbie took his arm. Behind them, Malcolm rubbed absently at his own throat and understood, with the first real flicker of fear he'd felt in years, that his cousin's practical, unimpressive new Omega might be the single most dangerous thing to walk into Clan Kilbride in a generation. Rain returned to the glen 3 days later, drumming steadily against the tall windows of Kilbride's old distillery office, where Robbie had claimed a desk buried under decades of production logs nobody had cross-checked in years. It was tedious. It was exactly what he needed to quiet the noise in his head. Heavy, familiar footsteps sounded in the corridor. James set a tray at the edge of Robbie's desk without ceremony, a plate of oatcakes, a mug of strong tea, steam curling up into the gray afternoon light. Mrs. Doyle said you skipped lunch, mid-audit. Eating breaks concentration. Robbie accepted the tea with unhidden gratitude, wrapping cold fingers around warm ceramic. James glanced at the ledgers scattered across the desk, brow furrowing. These are the distillery's cask records. Why do you have these? I was bored. Robbie pulled a page toward himself. Your bottling contractor is over-invoicing you 16% on new oak casks, charging for first-fill sherry barrels, delivering refill stock instead. I checked the cooperative's own manifests against your delivery logs. You're bleeding around 90,000 pounds a year on barrels alone. James stared at him. Rain filled the silence, tapping steadily against old glass. You audited my distillery, for fun. I told you I spent 6 years assessing claims for a living. I like finding where the numbers lie. Also, your bottling line runs 3 set shifts with no coordinated handover. You're paying overtime that could be eliminated with a single schedule change. I'm worth considerably more than 90,000 pounds, Robbie. Waste is waste, Robbie said, unmoved, sipping tea brewed exactly to his taste, though he'd never once mentioned a preference. Ignore the small leaks and the whole cask rots from the inside. That's poor stewardship, not thrift. James didn't argue. He pulled out the heavy chair across from Robbie and sat, watching him with an intensity that felt for once less like assessment and more like plain, undisguised curiosity. You didn't flinch at the ball, he said, after a long moment. Malcolm hit you with a direct dominance pulse. Most Omegas would have dropped straight to their knees. You quoted his export losses back at him instead. Robbie's pen stilled over the ledger. I told you, I'm not a typical Omega. Tell me why. There was no command behind it, no pulse of alpha authority, only a quiet, genuine ask. And something about the absence of pressure made it easier to answer honestly. My father owed money to men who didn't care about clan law or decency, only interest rates, Robbie said slowly. When someone from the Blackwater Ring corners you in a stairwell and wants a payment you don't have, dropping your eyes doesn't save you. It only makes you easier to hit. I learned young that instinct is a liability if you let it steer, so I switched it off, treated every threat like a claims form instead of a fear. It's the only reason I lived long enough to sit here arguing with you about barrels. James's jaw tightened, something dark and useless moving behind his eyes, old anger with nowhere left to land. And the debt, James said carefully. It's truly settled now? Your $4 million covered the principal. Whether the ring considers the matter closed for good is a different question. Men like that rarely let a ledger stay balanced if they can help it. I still sleep with my door locked out of habit, not fear. There's a difference. Robbie said it lightly, the way he says most things heavy enough to break someone else, and James's jaw tightened at how plainly he'd learned to carry that weight without ever once setting it down. If they contact you again, you tell me. Immediately. Not after you've already handled it your own way. That wasn't in the contract. I'm amending it. Verbally, right now. His voice dropped, serious beneath the afternoon's dry humor. You don't fight that battle alone anymore. Whatever else this marriage is or isn't, my name stands behind you now, and my name still frightens people who matter. Something in James's expression shifted, the cold, unreadable Alpha King dissolving, for just a moment, into a man who looked genuinely, helplessly fascinated. You're extraordinary, he said low, like the words had slipped out before he could stop them. Robbie's chest did something painful and unfamiliar. He picked his pen back up, if only to give his hand somewhere to go. I'm pragmatic, and currently off the clock. This contract doesn't require me to entertain you in a distillery office. James laughed, that same rusty, unpracticed sound, warmer each time he allowed it, and rose, pausing at Robbie's shoulder a beat longer than strictly necessary. Eat the oatcakes. The hand fasting's in a week, and I won't have you fainting through your own vows. Great Aunt Morag Kilbride arrived 4 days before the hand fasting the way a storm rolls in off the Minch, announced by considerable noise, several trunks of tartan swatches, and an opinion on every subject known to man or clan. Great Aunt Morag, 64. James's late father's elder sister, self-appointed head of wedding logistics, has never once said quietly what she could instead say at full volume across an entire hall. "Absolutely not," she declared, the moment she laid eyes on the seating plan Abernathy's assistant had painstakingly assembled. "You cannot seat Oliver anywhere near the pipers. He'll try to conduct them. He did it at the Fenwick wedding 2 summers past, and half the pipe band still won't speak to him." Robbie, quietly reviewing the caterer's invoices at the far end of the table, because someone evidently had to, looked up with genuine interest for the first time all morning. "Wait, Oliver's coming to the handfasting?" "Darling, of course he's coming. He's devastated, but he's civilized about it, which in this family counts as a full recovery." Morag turned a critical eye on Robbie next, head to foot, the way a general inspects new recruits. "So, you're the one who got himself arrested in the whiskey cellar. I took a wrong door. Your security drew their own conclusions." Morag settled herself with the practiced flourish of a woman who had never entered a room quietly in her life. "James hasn't laughed in front of staff in the better part of 4 years. Mrs. Doyle tells me you've managed it 3 times in a fortnight. I came expecting some scheming social climber, and instead I find a sarcastic claims adjuster who got locked up on arrival. Frankly, I'm delighted. Glad my personality's testing well with the committee." Morag barked a laugh, sharp and pleased, and patted Robbie's hand with the sudden, alarming affection of a woman who had decided on the spot that he belonged to her too. "Oh, I like him," she announced to the room at large, as though Robbie weren't sitting directly across from her. James, come see the face he's making. It's the very face your father used to make." James, who'd been reviewing security logistics with 2 guards by the door, approached with visible wariness, the caution of a man raised under his aunt's supervision and never fully recovered. "What face?" "The one he's making right now, tolerating you enormously and enjoying it more than he'd like to admit." Morag beamed at them both. "It's the exact face your father wore around your mother for the better part of a year, before he finally admitted he adored her. I give the 2 of you a month before James starts composing dreadful ballads." "I don't compose ballads," James said, with the particular flatness of a man who absolutely, at some point in his youth, had composed several. "He composed ballads," Morag Stage whispered to Robbie, thoroughly undeterred, "about a stag once. Compared its eyes to twin locks beneath the harvest moon. I still have the notebook. I'm bringing it to the reception, Aunt Morag. It's a wedding gift, James. Don't be tiresome." She turned back to the seating plan with brisk satisfaction, entirely unbothered by the small bomb she'd just detonated. "Now, Oliver goes at the far table, well clear of the pipers, beside Malcolm, so the 2 of them can be miserable at each other instead of at us. Robbie, darling, you'll sit beside me at the top table. I want a full accounting of James's worst habits before the vows, for material." He alphabetizes his whiskey by distillery, then by cask number, Robbie offered immediately. "James." "They were disorganized," James said with wounded dignity. He also once had an entire batch of casks recuperated because the wood grain didn't read correctly in photographs. It was for the export catalog, Morag. Presentation matters enormously in that market. "I have so much material," Morag said happily, already reaching for a fresh notepad, and Robbie, watching James attempt and fail to look properly wronged, felt something warm and unfamiliar settle low in his chest, the small, absurd comfort of being folded, without asking, into a family that argued over cask grain and dreadful stag ballads instead of debt collectors and broken kneecaps. It was, Robbie thought later, the first time in years that a room full of strangers had felt less like a threat to survive and rather more like something dangerously close to home. The night before the handfasting, the castle transformed into a small, controlled riot. Florists, pipers, security details, a small army of assistants trailing walkie-talkies, and the anxious scent of 100 strangers. Robbie escaped it the only way he knew, by finding the one place the wedding planners hadn't yet claimed, the old watchtower, its narrow stair spiraling up from a forgotten corridor near James's own rooms, opened onto a stone parapet, overlooking the black glass of the lock below. Robbie folded himself against the cold stone, knees drawn up, and let the ache in his skull finally have the quiet it had been asking for all day. He hadn't taken his suppressants in 2 days. He wanted a clear head for tomorrow. He told himself that was the only reason. Footsteps on the spiral stair. He didn't need to turn to know whose. The scent arrived first, peat smoke and heather, softer here than at the ball, unmistakably, unbearably familiar by now. James had shed his jacket. Sleeves rolled to the forearm, hair windblown from the climb, he looked, for the first time since the cellar, less like a laird and more like a tired man who had simply run out of places to hide from his own wedding. "Mrs. Doyle said you'd vanished. I needed a room with no opinions in it." James sat beside him on the cold stone, not touching, but close enough that his warmth pressed against Robbie's side like something solid. For a long moment neither spoke. Below them, the loch lay black and still under a scattering of stars. "Are you frightened?" James asked finally. "Of tomorrow?" "I'm frightened," Robbie admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of it, "of how little I mind the idea of it anymore." James's breath caught, audible in the quiet. He turned, and Robbie turned with him, and for a moment they simply looked at each other in the starlight. A laird and the man he'd bought, neither of them quite that anymore. "I want to show you something," James said. "Something I've shown no one outside my own bloodline." Robbie raised an eyebrow. "If this is a euphemism, it isn't, a ghost of a smile, it's a matter of trust. I'd like to offer you some before tomorrow makes it a legal formality." He stood, stepping back onto the open flagstones, and closed his eyes. Robbie watched, breath held, as something ancient moved beneath James's skin. A shudder, a low groan of bone rearranging, and where a man had stood a heartbeat before, an enormous white wolf now sat on its haunches. Fur pale as the frost gathering on the parapet stones, eyes the same unmistakable gray. Robbie's own instincts surged, the omega in him recognizing, on some cellular level, an alpha at his most unguarded and most powerful, but beneath the biological awe sat something purely human, quiet, plain wonder at the improbable trust of it. "You're beautiful," Robbie said before he could stop himself, and flushed at how unguarded it sounded against the wind. The wolf's ears flicked, and if a wolf could look smug, this one did. He padded closer, slow and deliberate, until his great head came to rest against Robbie's knee, warm and heavy, fur softer than it had any right to look. Robbie's hand moved before he'd decided to let it, fingers sinking into thick white fur, and the wolf made a low, rumbling sound against his palm that could only be called a purr. "Nobody sees this," Robbie said quietly, still stroking behind one large ear. "Why me?" The wolf huffed, a warm gust of breath against Robbie's wrist, and then the shudder came again, folding bone and fur back into the shape of a man, until James knelt there on the frost-rimed stone, close enough that Robbie could count the individual flecks of silver in his gray eyes. "Because you're the first person in a decade who's looked at me and seen a man instead of a title," James said, low and rough at the edges. "I wanted you to see the rest of it too, before we stand in front of half the Highlands tomorrow and pretend this is only an arrangement." Robbie's breath left him slowly. He reached out, no calculation left in it, no contract, no armor, and rested his palm against James's jaw, feeling the faint rasp of stubble beneath his fingers. "It stopped being only an arrangement somewhere around the oatcakes," Robbie admitted, quiet as a confession. James turned his face into Robbie's palm, closing his eyes, and for a long moment they simply stayed like that, kneeling together on the cold stone under the wide Highland sky, two men who had entered a contract and found, somewhere in its clauses, something neither of them had budgeted for at all. Below them, the loch lay perfectly still, as though even the water had decided to grant them this one quiet hour before the world arrived to claim its wedding. The old chapel on Kilbride land had stood for 600 years, its stone walls softened by candlelight, sprigs of white heather woven through every archway. Robbie walked its length on unsteady legs, the weight of every eye in the room pressing against his spine until he reached James at the altar, and the whole crowded chapel dissolved into white noise. He reached the steps. James held out his hand, and Robbie placed his palm against it, warm and solid, and grounding in a way 4 million pounds had never managed to be. The officiant began the old hand-fasting rite, the binding of wrists with tartan cord, the formal Gaelic phrasing, the historical weight of 100 generations of clan law, until she reached the vows and asked James, in the traditional tongue, if he would take this omega. James did not recite the rehearsed line. He turned fully to face Robbie, ignoring the officiant, ignoring the 400 watching guests, and said, voice carrying clean to the chapel's furthest pew, "I take him to protect. I take him to stand at my side, not as duty, but as a privilege I did not know I was capable of wanting. I claim him as my equal." A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the front rows. An alpha king, claiming an omega as an equal, in front of the very traditionalists his marriage was meant to appease. It wasn't in the script, and every council member present knew precisely what it meant. Robbie's throat closed. He hadn't rehearsed an answer to that. "And do you, Robbie, take him?" the officiant prompted gently. Robbie looked up into James's eyes and found, for the first time, no cold laird, no alpha king, no careful strategist, only a man who had just made him a genuinely terrifying promise in front of 400 witnesses. "I do," Robbie said, and his voice, to his own surprise, didn't shake at all. The tartan cord was wound around their joined wrists, warming quickly against their skin. When the officiant gave leave to seal the bond, Robbie braced for the brief, chaste kiss they'd rehearsed for the cameras. James didn't give him a chaste kiss. He cupped Robbie's jaw in one broad hand, giving him a full second to pull back. And when Robbie simply held still, breath caught, James closed the distance slowly, deliberately, and kissed him like a vow all its own. It wasn't hungry. It was worse than hungry, tender, unhurried, devastatingly certain, sending a wave of heat straight through Robbie's chest that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with the man doing the kissing. Robbie's fingers curled into James's lapel, holding on, and when James finally pulled back, the chapel had already erupted into applause neither of them fully registered. Somewhere in the third pew, Oliver Fenwick dabbed dramatically at his eyes with a tartan handkerchief and informed his neighbor, in a stage whisper that carried admirably, that he had seen this coming since the cellar incident. By the time the car pulled through Kilbride's gates near midnight, Robbie was running on fumes. 4 hours of handshakes, council members' thin-veiled insults, and the low-grade static of holding a public performance together had left him hollowed out, his skull pounding with the particular ache of an adrenaline crash finally landing. James, tie discarded, collar unbuttoned, watched him from the opposite seat with quiet concern. "You survived." "Barely," Robbie murmured, pressing a cold water bottle to his forehead. "I think Malcolm tried to poison my champagne. He hovered near the waiter for entirely too long. Malcolm's a coward. He wouldn't risk it." A dark edge crept into James's voice. "But if he ever crosses a line with you again, I'll ruin him publicly and enjoy every second of it. That wasn't in the vows, it's implied." The car stopped. Robbie's legs, when he stood, felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. He turned automatically toward the East Tower, toward his own room, his own worn jumpers, the collapse he'd been quietly rationing all night, only for a warm hand to close gently around his arm. "Where are you going?" "My room. Clause 9, I'm off the clock." "You're exhausted, and your sense souring with stress," James said low. "If you go up to that empty tower alone tonight, you'll spiral before you've got your boots off. Come to my rooms." Panic flared, quick and old. "That wasn't the deal. I sold you my public image. Not my—" Robbie stopped, unable to finish the sentence, throat tight. James's whole expression gentled. No command, no force. Just a step closer, his voice dropping to something almost unbearably soft. "I'm not asking for anything else, Robbie. I'm not changing the contract. I'm telling you that you look like you're about to shatter, and I refuse to let that happen alone in the dark." The fight went out of Robbie all at once, leaving nothing behind but a raw, unfamiliar vulnerability. He was so tired of holding every wall up alone. James didn't wait for permission. He slipped one arm beneath Robbie's knees, the other around his back, and lifted him clean off the ground. "I can walk," Robbie protested weakly, hands flying to grip his shoulders. "Hush," James said gently, already climbing the stairs. Robbie let his head fall against James's chest, listening to the steady drum of his heart, breathing in peat smoke and heather until the tension in his spine finally, fully uncoiled. James laid him not on the bed but in a worn leather chair by the fire and knelt to unlace his boots with careful, unhurried hands. "I can do that," Robbie whispered, face burning. "I know you can." James slid the second boot free. "You don't have to." He eased Robbie's jacket from his shoulders, undid the cufflinks one at a time, an act so entirely without expectation it felt, somehow more intimate than anything Robbie had braced himself for. When Robbie was down to his shirt, James pulled back the heavy plaid blanket on the bed, and Robbie crawled gratefully into sheets that smelled entirely of James. Dense and protective, unwinding the last knot in his chest. James dimmed the lamp, sat at the edge of the mattress, and rested one hand lightly over Robbie's ankle through the blanket. "Sleep," he said, quiet as a vow. Robbie closed his eyes. The headache was already fading. For the first time in his adult life, he believed without reservation that he was safe, and as sleep pulled him under, some distant, honest part of him understood that the contract had already been broken beyond any solicitor's repair. Sunlight cut a sharp gold line across the floorboards when Robbie woke, disoriented by the sheer quiet of the room. This wasn't the East Tower. The linen smelled of peat smoke and heather. Memory arrived in pieces: the chapel, the unscripted vow, the kiss that had nearly buckled his knees, James carrying him up the stairs like something precious. The other side of the bed was empty. A small, unwelcome pang of disappointment bloomed in Robbie's chest before he ruthlessly shoved it down. He found James in the kitchen, in worn denim and a faded jumper, staring at a glowing tablet with the mild, domestic focus of a man who bore no resemblance to the formidable laird who'd frozen a council member solid 12 hours earlier. "You're awake," James said, without looking up. "Mrs. Doyle left oatcakes and jam. The kettle's just gone off. You didn't wake me. Your heartbeat didn't settle until nearly 3. James set the tablet down, gaze sweeping over Robbie, something softening at the edges of his hardened features. "I stayed up to be sure you didn't bolt for the Glen. You have a habit of running when you're cornered. Clause 9 states my bodily autonomy within the private." "Stop hiding behind the paperwork," James interrupted gently. And it landed not as command, but as plea. "The contract got you through the door. It got the traditionalists off my back. But it isn't real, Robbie. What happened on the tower, what happened at the altar, that was real. Tell me I'm wrong." Robbie's hand froze over the kettle. He stared at the steam curling up from his cup, unable to turn around. "Real is a liability," he said, quiet and rough. "When you care about someone, you hand the world a knife and show them exactly where to aim. My father loved me, and he still sold my future to cover his own debts. Love just bankrupts people." Footsteps behind him. James stopped close, not touching his warmth a wall at Robbie's back. "I'm not your father. I'm not a lending ring looking for leverage. I'm the man who quietly bought out the entire Blackwater debt file last month, in full, and never once mentioned it because I didn't want you to feel it as a debt owed to me instead. I don't need leverage, Robbie. I have an empire already. I need a partner." Robbie turned. He was caught between the cold counter and James's chest, forced to tip his chin up, meeting eyes gone entirely open, entirely undefended. "I don't know how to do this," Robbie admitted, the words tasting like dry ash. "I only know how to survive." James reached up slowly, cupping the side of Robbie's face, thumb brushing his cheekbone. "Then survive with me. You don't have to submit. You don't have to play the soft, agreeable Omega, keep auditing my distillery, keep lecturing me about cask grain. Just stop pushing me away." Robbie searched his face for the catch, the trap, the fine print. He found none. Slowly, terrifyingly, something in him gave way, and he leaned his face into James's palm, closing his eyes. His suppressed scent, heather honey and warm bread, flared bright and unmistakable, curling around James's peat smoke like an answer to a question neither of them had dared ask aloud. James exhaled, shaky, and pulled Robbie flush against his chest, arms wrapping tight around him. Robbie fisted both hands in James's jumper and buried his face in the crook of his neck, no performance left in it at all. For the first time in his life, exactly where he wanted to be. 5 years. Robbie murmured against his skin. "The contract expires in 5 years. James laughed, low and warm, the sound settling into Robbie's bones. "I employ the most vicious solicitors north of Edinburgh, Robbie. We're renegotiating the terms this afternoon. You're stuck with me indefinitely." Robbie pulled back just far enough to look at him, a real private smile breaking across his face, the first one James had ever earned entirely for himself. "Fine," he said softly, "but you're still overpaying for oak casks." 1 year after the hand-fasting at Kilbride, and the clan council still hasn't recovered from the discovery that their Alpha King's practical Omega had quietly renegotiated 4 supplier contracts, fired the overcharging cooperage, and trimmed the distillery's annual waste by 14%, all before finishing his first cup of tea. Snow fell soft and silent over the glen, the tower room glowing warm and gold against the dark shapes of the pines below. Heather still somehow blooming in pots on the windowsill, because Robbie had personally threatened the head gardener within an inch of his life if it ever died on his watch. "You cannot threaten Hamish over a plant pot," James said, not looking up from the correspondence in his lap, though the corner of his mouth was fighting a smile. "I can, and I did. That heather has sentimental value. I fell in love with you under a version of it, technically. I fell in love with you in a wine cellar, technically, while you were being accused of theft. The heather came later and gets partial credit regardless, Robbie said serenely, settling onto the window seat beside him, tucking his cold feet under James's thigh without asking permission, a habit James had stopped pretending to mind months ago. A soft knock, and Mrs. Doyle appeared at the door, her expression managing both fondness and exasperation in equal measure. "Lord Oliver has arrived for supper, my lords. He's brought a gift. He is insisting it's for Robbie specifically, and I would very much like it removed from my front hall before it ruins the good rug." "Is it alive?" Robbie asked, with the weary caution of a man who'd learned, over the past year, that Oliver Fenwick's gestures of friendship tended to arrive with claws. "It's a very large, very opinionated sheepdog," Mrs. Doyle said. "He's named it Sterling, after, and I quote, that dreadful man from the council who tried to have you both blacklisted from the games." James made a strangled sound that might have been a laugh dying in his throat. Robbie dropped his face into his hands. "He named a dog after Malcolm," Robbie said, muffled. "He said it herds people it doesn't like directly into the loch," Mrs. Doyle confirmed, entirely deadpan, before retreating to handle the evening's other several crises. Oliver, once James's spurned almost suitor, had, against every reasonable expectation, become one of Robbie's closest friends over the year, a fact that still occasionally baffled James, who could not fathom how a man so thoroughly allergic to sentiment had ended up with a dramatic tartan-clad Omega for a best friend and a very large sheepdog named after a disgraced council rival living in his tower 3 days a week. "You're smiling," James observed later, once supper had descended into its usual chaos, Oliver recounting, at theatrical length, his ongoing feud with a rival Highland Games committee, the sheepdog Sterling attempting to steal an entire venison pie off the sideboard, Malcolm's absence from the guest list a small, satisfying victory Robbie privately enjoyed every single year. "I'm doing arithmetic," Robbie said, leaning into James's side as the fire popped low in the hearth. 5 years minus 1 already spent not despising you. 4 to go, technically, before the contract even lapses." And after that, Robbie considered him, the alpha king who still, on quiet nights, shed his human shape entirely just to let Robbie fall asleep with a hand buried in white fur, who had bought out his father's remaining debts in full without ever mentioning it, who had learned, slowly and against every hardened instinct, how to be soft with exactly one person in the world. After that, Robbie said, "I suppose I'll have to renegotiate. I hear the current Alpha King's a soft touch, if you catch him on a tower at the right hour. I'm told he's terrifying." "He's terrifying to everyone but me," Robbie said, and kissed him, unhurried, certain, no performance left in it at all, the kind of kiss that had nothing left to prove to any council, any camera, any clause ever drafted. Later, once Oliver had gone home still narrating his feud to anyone who'd listen, once Sterling the sheepdog had been forcibly relocated from the dessert course, once the fire had burned down to embers and the tower had gone quiet, Robbie found James standing at the tall window, watching snow settle over the dark shapes of the glen. "Come to bed," Robbie said from the doorway. "In a moment." James didn't turn, but he reached back, and Robbie crossed the room without being asked twice, fitting himself under his arm, watching the same falling snow. "I keep thinking about that first afternoon. The cellar. I signed you like an inventory item and told myself it didn't matter what kind of man I was buying, as long as he was convincing enough for the council." "You got a very convincing thief," Robbie agreed. "Terrible poacher, though. I want that on record permanently." James huffed, the sound warm against Robbie's hair. "I got considerably more than convincing. I got someone who fixed things I didn't know were broken. My accounts, my counsel, my aunt's opinion of me, apparently my own face, which I'm told hasn't looked this unguarded since before my father died. Don't get sentimental on me, James. I have a reputation for emotional restraint to protect." "Your reputation," James said, turning finally to look at him, eyes soft in the low light, "died the day you cried during Oliver's toast. I had something in my eye, for 11 minutes. "It was a very moving toast," Robbie said with as much dignity as he could muster, and James laughed, easy now, unpracticed no longer, a sound that had become as ordinary in that tower as the snow outside the window, and pulled him close, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing left that needed saying out loud. Outside, snow kept falling over the glen, soft and endless, and somewhere below, a very large sheepdog finally succeeded in stealing the last of the venison pie, and nobody in the house particularly minded at all.